Morning!
Maddening!
Welcome to the India Explained podcast, recorded in London and San Francisco. One take, unscripted, no rehearsal. So, Bunty, welcome back, and let's just jump into the conversation right away where we, excuse me, left off part one of this conversation. You made a very interesting observation that secularism, which at the time when we were growing up was seen as the foundation of nationalism, has now sort of come full circle where it's being defined by the Hindu right, broadly speaking, as the very antithesis of nationalism. So, if you look at the Hindu right discourse online, which I've been studying now for, I want to say, almost 20 years, there used to be a time when people were accused of being secular and anti national. Now, what's happened is just the word secular itself also carries the baggage and resonance of anti national. So, in some way, it shows us that this idea of the BJP of the right, the Hindu right broadly, this project, which has been very sort of successful. Um, a couple of other points I'll make, and then I'll just turn it over to you. That there was some BJP minion. I don't know. She works as a screenwriter or something of the kind. She's just made some really vicious remarks about the vice president, former vice president Ansari, who made a completely rational remark that there's a climate in the country where minorities are anxious. Modi made some very graceless remarks about that in his farewell speech uh, or in his speech signaling a farewell to the vice president, saying that he's now former vice president, saying that he's now free to pursue his ideology, etc. But people are essentially, making these all kinds of horrible remarks about him, saying he should go to Pakistan, he's a traitor, etc. So this sense that if you're Hindu, by default you're patriotic, and if you're a Muslim, by default you're disloyal, this idea that's been with us since before partition, and which we thought the discourse of secularism had at least managed to partially, if not wholly, quell, has just sprung back into public conversation in the most vicious kind of way in the last 3 years. So that's something that I think is very markedly different from the kind of conversations and expressions of nationalism that marked both 26 January and August 15th in the years that we were growing up.
I think, okay, let's think about this a little bit, Rohit, because I think secularism as a concept has been done a huge disservice in the first 35 to 40 years of independence by a succession of Congress governments.
Fair enough. Right.
Right. So, what has happened is the Nehruvian socialist secular project was a nice little lift off number with which we wanted to distance ourselves from a colonial past. But I don't think in our political imagination that what happened later on was secularism became shorthand for divisive vote bank politics, essentially peddled by very corrupt cowbelt politicians and scheming self-seeking politicians who were using like caste, faith, other types of affiliations to pander to saying that I carry everybody with me because I'm secular, and that means by definition that I can do what I want. So maybe I'm not putting this correctly, but the nub of the point that I want to make is secularism has been done a massive disservice in the formative stages, right? Then you look about the last 30 years, which kind of roughly correlates to the rise of the BJP and the right wing movement. They have basically started using this phrase, the secular equals secular, which is basically a form of sickness. And what we need to do is, in order to imagine ourselves as a modern, powerful nation, it's a nation which is, and different phrases have bandied around, because Indians love complicated phrases of benign majoritarianism and all sorts of different numbers are thrown at this. But basically, the call that's gone out is what we want to do is reshape secularism and craft it differently. And my main point would be that I think secularism needs a new champion in India. And from the current political, whether it's Mamata Banerjee, who's actually a very devious vote bank politician herself,
I agree with you completely on that. Right.
who panders to
Yeah.
kind of a certain appeasement of the Muslim vote bank, and particularly the Bangladeshi illegal immigration. So she's doing that. So she's trying to project herself on the national stage as a credible secular option. She's not. I don't think, the Nitish Kumar Lalu Yadav thing, which is kind of failed experiment, would ever stood a chance, because Lalu
Right,
Prasad is essentially a corrupt man.
right,
So then you start, and this guy at the Aam Aadmi Party who kind of won, Kejriwal, who won in Punjab and Delhi, has done a disservice, because he reminds me of a low grade version of Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, which is, he's got all the rhetoric in place but none of the organization, and
right.
so I don't see him. So what we genuinely have in India is an absence. And I'm not talking about the Congress Party, because they are a joke, because what they have done is they have damaged the idea of secularism, and
Yeah,
in kind of promoting a nepotistic leadership culture, they are saddled with a mother-son combination who are not credible in any combination that you want to play them. So the question is that, yes, we are a secular nation, and yes, secularism is, there's an attempt on part of right-wing politics in India to rub off secularism from the definition of our nation state. And the question is, who is poised to step up and say, actually, secularism stands for good things. It stands about honest politicians. It stands about carrying everybody with you, which is what the intention was. So that's my rant about it. But I think secularism has been failed, and somebody needs to pick up the gauntlet and correct it. And at the
right.
moment, we don't have that corrective measure.
You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that's happened is that the Congress, because of its political dominance, kind of claimed a monopoly over secularism, made it its house ideology, so to speak. And, we need to think of secularism as a value or as a framework that goes beyond the Congress. Now, the Congress is a political party, it's going to do what it does, right? It's may not have in some ways the vileness of the BJP, but it has a lot of blood on its hands. The 1984 anti-Sikh riots, uh, the appeasement of both in some ways landowners and political elites, maintaining a kind of feudal structure, but also sort of dealing and hobnobbing with the worst, most regressive elements among minorities, the Shah Bano case, and so on. So all of that is valid, and I'm completely in agreement with you. I would also add that I think there's civil society, or sort of left liberal activist civil society, which brings together people who are both in the political left as well as people who are in the left generally, but not parts of may not be part of the CPI CPIM. They are also to blame, because uh, there's this whole sort of idea that if we are critical towards minorities, minority communalism, or if we are critical towards the Congress at this point, somehow we will strengthen the right and our arguments will be co-opted by the right. So we have to
Correct.
maintain a strategic silence. And I've also seen this with academics. In fact, I had raised this very question at a seminar. There was a seminar at Emory University on the question of subaltern, it was on the theme of subaltern studies, and a number of the academics who were the founders of the Subaltern Studies Collective were there. And, I made this whole point about the fact that there are these, certain acts of communalism and so on. Why is there always this kind of fear of the right co-opting criticism of minorities, particularly Muslims? And I think one of these, senior stalwarts actually got very annoyed, because what I was raising was the question of inconsistency and hypocrisy. And, there was some sort of, I think, very defensive response that he gave, saying that, well, this is a matter of life and death for minorities. So, or for us. So I think the point that a lot of people make is that I have the right to be inconsistent in the name of some higher truth. But
Right.
if you're going to be inconsistent in that regard, if you're, let's say, not going to report a particular case of, let's say, molestation, and this is something that I know incidents like this.
Yeah.
There's an academic in Delhi University who says that there were a case of molestation where
Yeah.
the men involved were Muslims, but they didn't publicize the case because they didn't want the Hindu right to make merry of it and communalize the issue. But the point then is that the young woman who was the victim of molestation,
Mm.
was deprived justice, and someone in the name of secularism decided that this was the right thing to do. And
Right.
and I see exactly the same thing happening with the CPIM, the student leaders in the CPIM, the left JNU crowd, with regard to violence that's committed in Kashmir by Kashmiris, particularly by Kashmiri Muslims.
Right.
We know, for instance, that the Kashmiri Muslim project is actually a Sunni majoritarian project with a militant streak to it, and there is a terrorist dimension to it. And I'm not denying anything about the excesses and the human rights violations that the Indian state has covered, but this complete refusal to criticize any of those, Islamist Muslim fundamentalist actions in Kashmir is, I think, a symptom of the same malaise. Now, the very good question is who's going to bell the cat? Secularism is damaged. It seems like a tainted ideology. Is it going to be ordinary citizens? Is there going to be a people's movement? I don't know. The last people's movement we saw was against corruption, and corruption, that's what, led to India against corruption and Kejriwal. But will secularism, will that happen for secularism? I don't know.
I don't think it'll, given the current state of play, I don't think secularism is going to act as a kind of rallying cry for a disparate group of people who are essentially driven by, so if you just driven by self-interest and kind of devious vote bank politics. I'm kind of thinking of a time where in India you have somebody like Macron, who in France, a complete outsider, and I'm not holding up his politics as desirable,
Right.
but I'm saying to you that here is a person who's young, accomplished, and successful in another life, who steps into public life and says that, we can reboot this system, and it's not necessarily a choice between the old and the new. And I think if India goes for a reboot around, particularly around secularism, I think we probably need to tweak the definition of secularism, meaning that it's not just the absence of faith or absence of recognized religion in the state. It's not treating people differently based on their religion. So, special treatment for Muslims around personal law and things like that, it should be something of the past. If things are happening, where people are being granted concessions because they are Muslims, or being looked upon favorably because they're Hindus. Those are the kind of things. It's kind of escalated in a tit for tat manner, which is, in successive Congress governments and kind of coalition governments, there was kind of massive minority appeasement, and we are living through at the moment a 5 to 10 year cycle of a backlash,
Right.
which is understandable. And the question is, I don't think it'll balance out, because I think either this backlash will become the kind of tsunami of kind of majoritarianism, where kind of it becomes like a mega Nepal, a Hindu nation, right? That's what it becomes. But if there is a new type of politics where somebody credible comes on, and this credible person doesn't because I think secularism has also failed to carry a lot of people with it, because even in the first 30-35 years when the project was taking hold, I think this is my personal view, secularism essentially was a very urban metropolitan concept, because
Right.
in the villages and the rural areas of India, people were still identifying. There were Muslim villages, Hindu villages, Dalit villages, forward caste villages. So, and progressively everybody played on that. So secularism left behind, like as you in one of your articles which I was reading recently, where you kind of joined up the discussion around political movements in America with the saffronization of India, so the kind of the right movements in both countries. I think one of the things that I was thinking about this reading your work was that it has secularism, like in Europe, the European Union project in Britain has left a lot of people behind in the last 30 years.
Right.
It hasn't carried people. Globalization hasn't resulted in equal chances for everybody. Certain people, certain sections have benefited disproportionately. And I think that is the case with secularism as well. The idea of a secular India has benefited urban, metropolitan, well educated, and often wealthy sections of society. And
Right.
now we live in a time where I think there is this backlash. And the only way that you can stand up to this backlash is not by failed politicians with, discredited approaches, but somebody new. But I don't know who that new person is. I hope somebody's listening and can urge somebody to step forward. It has to be somebody ground up. It has to be somebody who is, absolutely clean, but also with some chutzpah of, getting things done. And Kejriwal is a bit of a joke, because
Right.
he literally doesn't know how to govern. He thinks everything is student union politics, and the world is not. And
Right.
Oh, that's my thinking
Yeah.
anyway.
So I think, yeah, on that, I'd say that realistic but also maybe somewhat hopeful note, we should wrap this up. Secularism is again, I think, a topic on which there's a lot to be mined. Maybe one the next time we go back to talk about secularism, we can consider what is distinctive about Indian secularism, and if it's if there is something in secularism that goes Indian secularism that goes beyond the model in which it was imagined by uh, the founders of independent India, which was skewed towards, as you point out, urban metropolitan elites. That is there a kind of secularism in that we see in wider strands of Indian life? But we'll pick that up later. Okay, we'll be back to conclude this three-part episode on expressions of patriotism in just a second. Take care, Bunty.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.